So, in terms of your novel, what you want to look at is what's happening in your novel. So, this is about this, but it can also be about misogyny against women. It can be about hate crimes of any kind. But the idea, this was developed by the Southern Poverty Law Center in the United States during, in coordination with Holocaust survivors, about how did we end up with Nazis. Most people, there are very few people around who are going to say like, oh, Nazis are okay. So they wanted to say like, how does this happen in a population? How does this take hold? And so it was studied, and so it started out with Holocaust survivors who were Jewish wanted to understand, and the German people themselves wanted to understand, how do we get here? How do we get to, concentration camps? And so it starts, they make it like a pyramid. Remember, a pyramid is a thing that is built on a base. So technically this pyramid shouldn't be drawn as a triangle. It should be drawn as like a pyramid. Like it's a thing that like rests on a thing. So like all of these things are the building blocks really to how we get, unfortunately, how we get there. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. So it starts with not knowing anything or no contact, and then it goes to indifference. And so things like that are indifferent are well, it's not my problem, it's not my issue. And that can include, in terms of novels, is especially in fantasy novels, like in Hunger Games, or in a lot of the things that you see on the screen, like Twilight. The authors themselves didn't even think to include BIPOC people. They just assumed that everyone was white, and that's just a failure of their imagination, right? That's indifference. And so, like, a lot of fantasy fans are freaking out right now because Lord of the Rings is going to have a whole series that is got black dwarves, and they're flipping out, right? So it's indifference and it's exclusion, because the underlying assumption there is that white is the norm, right? So it's indifference in that I don't have to deal with this because I'm light-skinned, so it's not really my thing, and I don't feel I should speak on it, and I don't have to act on it because it's not my problem. It's up to other people to fix this. The next one is minimization. This is when you refuse to believe people in their lived experience. So if you have a character that says, I'm being followed around in Shoppers Drug Mart because of my race, and the other person says, oh, I'm sure it's just because you're young, or they minimize it. They're like, oh, you're just imagining things, right? So it's discounting what it is. It's when somebody explains to you that what you're feeling isn't what you're feeling. It's a form of gaslighting, if you think about it, okay? So when people minimize, the other thing that people do to minimize conflict is they make a joke out of it. And that'll very often happen within a friendship, right? So we'll just joke about it and move on. Now, veiled racism is a little different. Veiled racism comes in when somebody's very surprised that you have a degree. Oh, I didn't know they had a master's, right? Why wouldn't they assume that that person had a master's? They're a teacher in a school. They're just as likely to have a master's. Or people assume that I have one because I'm white, and they don't assume that an Indigenous teacher has a master's degree, right? So it's that sort of like prejudice and stereotypes. It's very rooted in that, but it's also can be exclusion. So this is the kind of thing where people can say, well, it's not that I hate Muslim people, but you can't cover your hair. Well, that's gonna like stop women with a hijab from coming in, right? Or that kind of thing. But that's actually edging into what's called discrimination. Discrimination is when you have a policy or like a way of behaving that stops people from being able to do a thing. So right now in Quebec, they have a policy saying no religious artifacts in their civil offices, but they're letting people use crosses. They're just not letting people wear a hijab, like the headscarf. That's discrimination, right? It's unfair policies based on race. And most people, when they talk about racism, they sort of think of it as individual acts in this range. Sometimes they might think of it in here, right? But a lot of people don't really see the base of it. You don't get to veiled racism unless you've been minimizing the lived experience of people and you've been indifferent because it doesn't apply to you, so you don't have to think about it. Now, you have to go through all these things when you're discriminating. You then move into, and this is where it really escalates, and this is, you could call this like the red zone. Okay, and this is identified as the red zone. So this whole thing is the red zone because you're going from, and the discrimination is also the red zone. So this is when we're moving into acting that affect people, right? Like veiled racism sucks and it shouldn't be there, but it's not physically stopping you from doing anything. It's creating a hostile environment and it's crap. But up until this point, what's going on is survivable. It sucks, but it's survivable. And a lot of people live with it. But this becomes not survivable. We're getting more and more to a point where people want you dead, which is violent acts. So all of these things, the radicalization of all these white nationalist guys who go and shoot up a church, right? They start out with indifference. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with me. And then they feel excluded from power because people are talking about people that are not them. And then they minimize any facts that come their way. They're like, well, you say that fact, but you're a liberal, so I don't have to listen to you. You're a libtard. And then it gets into veiled racism where they're like, well, I don't want to be racist, but, well, you're going to say something racist. We all know it. Then you get into discrimination where they're literally like, well, the whole team is going to go and have a barbecue at my house, but we just didn't happen to invite that one black kid, right? That's discrimination. Then we get into calls to violence, and the internet can include this. And this is what they didn't have when this model was created. There's new models now, but this is an old model after World War II. So you get calls to violence. So think about Trump and how he called on them to storm the Capitol. That was a call to violence, and it led to violent acts. They invaded the Capitol. People died. Right? So even when people are they're just joking, oh, I'm just being a troll. But whenever you call for violence, you're solidly into this territory now. You're advocating violence. And it's a very easy bridge to go from a call to violence to actually perpetrating one. Now, in your book, you need to determine where your book is at. If your book doesn't have, and this happened to a couple of people, like Matthew's book takes place in historical 16th century China. So there's no real this, right? Because it's just indifference. Like the person didn't write anything in there about any other places. It's pretty xenophobic in that way. Or at least they haven't made an effort to include any of this, right? So it just didn't count. It was just here. Minimization in a novel. Well, in the novels for the Hunger Games, they were down here. And then when you look at the actual movies, then they added in a few people, right? But then it's just they never address race. It's kind of like Bridgerton, like they just added in people, but they didn't really talk about race. That's minimization. So they're solidly there, right? They're minimizing it. Minimizing it is like when you say, oh, I'm not racist, I don't see color. Well, if you don't see color, you're indifferent to the suffering of people who actually have an issue, because other people most definitely do see color. And so you're in this indifference phase, right? So where is your novel? That's all you got to say. So you make this sketch, you label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. And then you put an example from your novel of where your novel's at. Like if there's a violent act, is the violent act in your novel tied to all of this stuff? Is it a hate crime? Is it tied to white supremacy? Or if there is people excluding someone, right? Is it because of racism, right? So you have to determine that for yourself, and that's what that panel is about.